we'll be talking about the effects of the universal child benefits on poverty. And in particular, I will study the role of labor supply adjustments and fertility adjustments in sort of reducing the impact of the universal child benefit on poverty. The motivation for this paper is, first of all, I think we can all agree that child poverty is one of the most despicable things that happen in our societies. We can always argue that perhaps adults are to some extent responsible for what they do, but essentially children are definitely, they don't have this influence on whether they live in poverty or not. And at the same time, we know that this really determines their future outcomes. So essentially, a lot of things happen in the childhood that then, lead to better or worse outcomes in the future, right? So it's super important to try to improve the well-being of children. Okay. So we have if, in the Polish discussion, I guess it was kind of said that this transfer is very exceptional, and it is, and I will talk about it in a second why it is exceptional. But universal child benefits are present in most EU countries, so this is not something that's like non-standard thing. We have it here in Austria, we have it in Germany, but we also have it in many Central and Eastern European countries, such as Baltic countries, Slovakia, and so on. So the question is, do universal child benefits reduce child poverty? There are definitely, these mechanical positive direct effects because they increase the incomes of the parents, but perhaps, there might be negative effects on parental labor supply, and it also may incentivize to increase fertility, and these incentives will be strongest for people with lowest incomes, essentially. So this, discussion, this is nothing new. So this dates back at least to Thomas Malthus. So when he was essentially sort of considering similar like social assistance programs in England that were then introduced there, so the poor laws, he was mentioning these two channels. So essentially, the first one is this effect on fertility. He was worried that essentially this social assistance will lead to some uncontrollable, essentially, increase in fertility. And then secondly, there is this focus on efficiency, we would call it this today, right? So the fact that this may discourage hard work, essentially. We are not very worried right now about increasing fertility in high fertility countries, unlike in Thomas Malthus' times in England. But the question about quality versus quantity is still there. So the way I see the contribution of this project is essentially, first of all, I contribute to the literature on the fertility effects of cash transfers. And here, I contribute by by analyzing fertility adjustments across income distribution and a much larger shock that has been than the shocks that have been analyzed so far. And the other strands of literature that I contribute to is the strand of literature studying the effects of child benefits on child poverty. And here I want to really disentangle these two factors that may limit the scale of the poverty reduction associated with cash transfer. And the main findings, it's gonna be maybe not super long talk, but still perhaps it's better to fix the ideas right now. First of all, so what I will do, I will analyze changes in the structure of birth after the introduction of a large universal child benefit. I will also show you the sort of short-term effects on fertility, on total fertility. And what I find is that there was a clear divergence of birth rates after the introduction of the transfers. So essentially, low-income couples are now much more likely to give birth than high-income couples. And it hasn't been like this before. And then I'm doing like a microsimulation exercise. So essentially, I'm asking the question of how much child poverty would be reduced in the absence of adverse behavioral responses. So these parental labor supply responses that I estimated in another paper of mine, and fertility responses that I'm fertility adjustments that I'm kind of estimating here. Although this is I have to say, it's a pretty, very, very descriptive, at least in this part, when I studied the divergence of birth rates. And what I find in the end is that the role of fertility adjustments, even though they are really huge, is very small. It's very limited. And I'm gonna talk, and I'm gonna try, and I will try to explain why this is the case. All right. So we're starting here, exceptionally generous child benefit that was introduced in Poland. It was a monthly transfer of around $125, which was like 30% of per capita disposable income, 30% of net minimum wage. What's nice about this setup is that it was rapidly implemented. The first transfers were received 5 months after the elections, and then it was universal for the second and each subsequent child under 18, and it was means tested for the first child. The costs were equal to 1.2% of GDP. So this is, compared to all other programs, it's like enormous shock. And from 2019 onward, it was expanded. So now it's universal for all children, and its costs amounted in 2019 to 2% of GDP. Right now, it's even more, I guess, after the latest updates. And importantly, there were no changes to existing social assistance programs. So there existed some, modest, small scale programs that were helping families, and they were left in place. So I want to try to convince you that this shock was really, really exceptional compared to other countries. So there are 3 papers that I can refer to because they also study the fertility effects, at least in the economics literature. These are the main ones. So Cohen and his co-authors studied a policy in Israel where it was like 7,000 over 18 years. It was a monthly payment. In Libertad Gonzalez studies the effects of a one-time payment, which was quite generous. I mean, it was 4,000, but it was only one-time payment, right? So this was not a monthly payment. And finally, Milligan studies a policy in Canada. Canada has a very generous unconditional cash transfers at the moment, but he studies a bit of an older policy. And there it was like this transfer amounted to around 8,000 over 5 years. It was a quarterly payment. In Poland, a country which I guess it's important to say that it's, it has lower incomes than all of these 3 countries mentioned above. It was 27,000 over 18 years, right? So the monthly payment of $125, if you multiply this by 12 months and 18 years, it gives you the number of $27,000. So this is a lot. And importantly, this was also, in all of these other cases, these transfers, these countries sort of reached these levels of generosity after some time. In Poland, it was introduced essentially overnight. So overnight, parents from receiving nothing, they started to receive a lot. So when you look at the government expenditure on family benefits, so it includes both child benefits but also parental leaves, for instance, expenditure. You can see this huge jump in Poland between 2015 and 2019. So essentially from around 1% of GDP to nearly 3% of GDP, right? And therefore Poland became, after being like in the sort of the middle of the EU countries when it comes to the government spending on family benefits, it became one of the countries with the highest spending on family benefits in Europe. And here you can see how it looked, how it evolved over time, because I will also show you later on some time series, so it's important. So you can say that essentially the government spending was pretty stable until 2015, and then you have this huge jump, which is completely explained by the, by the increase in the child benefit. I mean, the introduction of the child benefit, and then you see this expansion of child benefit in 2019, since it was introduced in the second half of the 2019, so it takes time to sort of for the data to really reflect this. So it jumped quite rapidly after 2019 as well. But this, I think, is the most sort of telling picture. So here what I show you is for OECD states, all the OECD states that have, universal child benefits, and as you can see, there are many of them. And you can see the child benefit amount as percentage of average earnings, because obviously you could say, perhaps minimum wage can be different and so on in various countries, but average earnings, I guess, is a good measure. And then we also, this isolates all the other family policies, right? So as you can see, there is no country that's even close to what Poland offers in terms of universal child benefits when you think about them as percentage of average earnings. So for instance, there was this huge debate in the US during pandemic times. They expanded the child tax credit, which basically became a universal cash transfer. But even then, and it was pretty generous. You can see this compared to other countries, but still it was much smaller than the Polish program, right? So the only thing that can actually compare to the Polish program, but it's not entirely universal, that's why I didn't put it here, is the Canadian child benefit. The Canadian child benefit is exceptionally large, and it's like around 10% of average earnings. But it's phased out at some point, quite quickly, so I didn't include it in this graph. So we are talking about extremely large shock that happened essentially overnight, and it happened 4 or 5 months after the elections, right? So there was no time to essentially adjust your fertility. It takes more time than just 5 months to essentially. Yes, although, okay, this is not very important for this paper, because in this paper I will actually show you the effects the effects on the fertility, which actually happened 9 months after the announcement of this policy in November 2015. Right, so I have this other paper on labor supply effects. So from there I take this estimate of the labor supply responses. So what I find there is that essentially for each $100 in unconditional cash transfers received, households reduce their earnings by $14. Okay, so I have minus 0.14 marginal propensity to earn out of unearned income. This is in line with the studies for lotteries in Sweden. It's much smaller. This response is much smaller than, for instance, in the US. The estimates for the US are larger. But I will show you probably in several, but they don't really affect these results as much. Right. So what the literature tells us, well, in high fertility countries, we find mixed results. So mixed results on the effects of unconditional cash transfers on fertility. There are some papers that show that they actually affect fertility in high fertility countries. There are some countries that show that there are no effects. It perhaps depends on who's getting the money. So there are some papers that showing that, for instance, if mothers get money, they don't increase fertility. But essentially there are some mixed results. So compared to this, I think there is a consensus in the economics literature on positive effects of these cash transfers on fertility in low fertility countries, so high income countries essentially. So we see it in Israel, we see it in Spain, and we see it in Canada essentially. And I will follow, to just estimate the short-term effects, I will follow the strategy developed by Libertad Gonzalez, who was studying this one-time payment in Spain. So essentially, I will try to, so what she's doing is basically she's estimating regression discontinuity design with conceptions around the announcement date and births 9 months after the announcement using monthly data. So I don't have data on conceptions, I don't have data on abortions. She's showing that essentially there were positive effects on fertility, negative effects on abortions, but I have the information on, monthly information on births from just the demographic yearbook. Of course, there are problems here in estimating when estimating these effects using this RDD design. So essentially, well, I have no data on conceptions. She has data on conceptions, maybe not perfect, but okay. Then there is obviously a space between a fertility decision and a conception. So it's not, it sometimes takes time for parents to essentially, get a child essentially even after they made the decision, right? So this RDD only measures really the discontinuity in time. So only measures those parents that managed to conceive the baby quickly after the fertility decision. There is variation in the duration of pregnancy. I don't have data on conception, so this is an issue here. There is strong seasonality in Poland when it comes to births. So I have to deseasonalize data. And there is a question whether, about the trust in policy announcements, right? So in some countries, it may be lower than in others. So in the end, I estimate local average treatment effect, and it's probably smaller than the true effect because, as I said, for instance, it's not clear whether all parents or potential parents actually believe that this policy will be introduced, even though it was announced by the Prime Minister in her inaugural speech. All right, so my outcome variable is similar to Gonzalez variable. Essentially, nothing is different. So I have log births divided by the number of days in a month to just account for the differences in the length of months. I do some seasonal adjustment, so I calculate residuals from model with month fixed effects, but I can do this also, in different ways. The results stay the same essentially. But it's important to adjust it seasonally because otherwise there is a lot of fluctuations and you will get nothing. But whether you control for it, you additionally control for it, or you calculate year-to-year changes, that doesn't really affect results. And for transparency, I estimate this regression design for various bandwidths because you may know that sometimes this really matters, like what bandwidth you take. So essentially, regardless of the bandwidth you take, the effects are pretty huge. So these short-term effects, as I said, they are definitely underestimations. They are equal to around 6% of the 6%, right? So essentially the number of births increased by 6% immediately following the introduction of the transfer. And there's always, these graphs shown when we talk about the RD. So they look really nice. There is essentially no trend before, no trend afterwards, no clear trend afterwards. And you can see this huge discontinuity essentially. So if you would now fit some, quadratic trends, cubic trends, you would get essentially similar picture. So it's pretty clear if you look in the data that something happened. So that people really adjusted their fertility. Obviously, it's a question whether they just accelerated their fertility or this is also an effect on the completed fertility. It's not clear from here. I don't have data on age, unfortunately. By the way, this is because in the next slides, I will show you the data based on survey data. This is obviously from the administrative registers, right? So it's definitely very high quality data. But what I wanted to say is that unfortunately in the yearbook, there is no monthly information about the age of mothers. So I cannot unfortunately check, whether something changed when it comes to age. If something changed when it comes to age, then it's probably an acceleration and not really a completed fertility effect. All right, so this is RDD estimate. I would think about it as a lower bound of the true effect of these even short-term effects, because it takes time between decision and conception, and then also because of this trust. I don't think people are very trusty in Poland when it comes to our government policies. And then now what I want to show you is this concern about perhaps changes in the selection into parenthood, right? So I will show you changes in the structure of births depending on parental income before and after the introduction of the transfer. I also show you some selection results. So essentially some regressions with also some other variables like education. So what are the theoretical priors here? The fertility effects should be negatively correlated with parental income. In most of these papers, that's the result. Not all of them, to be honest. So first of all, because of because perhaps child is a normal good, and this is actually the thing which is not entirely clear, right? Because there are papers that show that there's, and Becker argued that there's negative income elasticity essentially. So it's perhaps So this may be not true. But even if you think that it's not a normal good, then usually what people find is like very low income elasticities, essentially. Even if they are negative, they are really small. But then definitely, price of a child is lower for low-income parents than for high-income parents. So when we look in the data, we see that parents, high-income parents spend much more money on their children, on their education, on their clothing and other stuff than low-income parents. So essentially, their price, the price of a child for high-income parents is higher than for low-income parents. And then obviously, the price elasticity will imply that essentially these effects should be larger for low-income parents than for high-income parents. So the data I'm going to use is household budget survey. It gives you detailed info on household income, expenditures, and demographic structure. It's a repeated cross-section, unfortunately. I don't have a longitudinal dimension. And the outcome variable is essentially, I define it as occurrence of birth within the last 12 months. So I have information on all the household members. I know when they were born. I mean, I know the month of birth, I guess. So I definitely know the age. And obviously the first endogenous children, so the first children that may be the effects of, child benefit, they will be born in 2017, right? Because again, we need to wait. We need to wait. I mean, first will be already in 2016, but I only have this information for the whole year. So essentially my first whole year with the endogenous children will be like in 2017, 2018. The income variable that I'm going to use is equivalent couple earnings. So these are wage earnings, income from self-employment, and paid leave payments. And I will also use throughout this paper OECD equivalence scales to calculate these equivalent couple earnings. But obviously I do not take into account those kids that were born in, because this would just bias the results. So I use this scales based on the number of children they had 1 year old or older. Yes, I restrict the samples to couples, to different sex couples, and to women's and couples in which women's age is between 25 and 39. Okay, so first I'm going to show you some results on selection into parenthood. So it will be, just descriptive statistics and some regression where I try to isolate these effects. So I will show you couples with a new child versus all the other couples, and how they differ on descriptives, on observables, and then I will try to isolate some of these impacts using simple regression. But this is obviously nothing really causal. All right. So what you can see here is essentially this descriptive statistics for 2 periods. So the pre-treatment period between 2011 2016, and post-treatment period between 2017 2021. And the first thing that's pretty clear here is essentially in the pre-treatment period there was basically no difference between in the equivalized earnings between those that gave birth and those that didn't give birth. So it was the income levels of new parents and all the other couples were very similar. So there is nothing like if anything, there is maybe small positive selection on earnings. But what happens after 2017 is that you get this clear difference. So suddenly, these new parents have their earnings lower than those that don't give birth by like more than 10%, right? So there is this huge change. And if you look at the education, the sort of the pattern is quite similar, right? So you can see that for both for those that didn't give birth and those that gave birth, we see this this Polish thing. So the upgrading, the educational upgrading, but it was much faster in the group that didn't give birth than in the group that gave birth, actually, right? So this difference in the educational levels got much smaller. So this positive selection on education weakened quite substantially. Yes. So when you control for all these things, you can see this clear pattern that, again, that the earnings, when you look at the sort of association of earnings with parenthood, it became more negative in the post-treatment period than it was in the pre-treatment period, right? So once you control for all these other variables, you could also see this kind of negative association between earnings and parenthood or fertility in the pre-treatment period, but it got quite stronger. And this, controlling for like earnings, then the effects of education and partners' education kind of disappear, except for this decline, this weakening of the positive association of births, of fertility with the partner's education, the potential father's education. All right. And now another thing that we can look at is essentially, and this is something that I'm going to use for the microsimulation, is to look at birth rates for low-income and high-income couples, so below and above median income. And here I will use this an even study approach. Again, this is very descriptive, obviously, where I essentially have this binary variable measuring whether someone is below and above median income, and interacted with the year fixed effects, right? And the variable, again, explained, is still the same. So essentially, fertility, giving birth to a child in their last 12 months. And what you can see very clearly is that, first of all, in the pre-treatment period, these birth rates were very, very similar in both groups. So it really didn't matter whether you're below median or above median income. You probably had very similar birth rates, essentially, in the pre-treatment period. But when you look at the post-treatment period, there's this huge divergence, which happens almost immediately. So you can see that these parents with income below median, couples with incomes below median increased their birth rates a lot, whereas these birth rates were quite stable for households above the median, right? Another important thing is that this is very persistent. So if we would believe in the story that essentially, there were these fertility adjustments, but they were only like a timing effect, what we should see then is some sort of like a opposite effect in this part of the time series, right? So they accelerated first their fertility, they had to decline it afterwards, right? Because the completed fertility would be unchanged. But what we can see is that this divergence is permanent, essentially. And even after 2020, and this is, by the way, I'm always how can I call it? I'm angry at the media saying that looking at just the births after 2020 and saying that child benefit, this is somehow an evidence for like the child benefit having no effects, right? Obviously, we had other shocks after 2020, and you can see this clear decline in the birth rates after 2020, but essentially this difference is still there, maybe a little bit smaller, but still there. What it means is obviously that a larger share of children are now born in low-income couples than it was in the pre-treatment period. So we have more kids that are potentially born into poor families, essentially, because they were incentivized more to increase their fertility. Right. So when you look at the event study sort of graphs, it's just a mirror of what we've seen before, but here I control also for all these, educational upgrading, this kind of stuff. So what you can see is parallel trends before, and then you have a strong increase in fertility in among couples with their incomes being below median. And again, it's really, really a persistent trend. What I also want to show you is that I can, because I have individual level data, unfortunately, as you can see, they are not very precise, by the way, the estimates. I would like to have, admin data, but I don't. But anyway, I can show you the responses on the extensive margin. So, in the extensive margin, I look at the probability that someone will get their first child, essentially. So I only limit to those couples that had no children before, 1 year before. And I can also show you the effects on the intensive margin. So for those parents that essentially had their children, had some children already 1 year before. And you can see that that essentially these effects, if you would average them, I mean, there are some jumps here, but again, this is really, these samples become a little bit small. But anyway, if you would average these effects, they are very similar. So it's not just, extensive or intensive margin adjustment, it's really both. But yeah, it's clearer that the intensive margin responses are a bit clearer because also the samples are sample is much larger. There are much more couples that have children than those couples that don't have children. Right. But if you would compare this to like the average sort of probabilities, these effects are pretty similar in magnitude. Right. And so the rest of this talk is essentially microsimulation, a very simple microsimulation exercise. So, knowing that more children are now born, perhaps due to the introduction of the child benefit, born into the poor families, this is obviously reducing the scale of the poverty reduction, right? So I essentially, reweight all the sample to get these 4 scenarios. Essentially, in the first scenario, there is child benefit, there are no labor supply effects, and there are no fertility adjustments. So it's like a maximum poverty reduction you can achieve. In the second scenario, I get I tease out the negative labor supply effects because I keep the fertility constant, but I introduce this negative labor supply effect. So I essentially adjust this labor supply by the marginal propensity to earn out of unearned income. In the third scenario, I get the scenario in which in which I tease out the fertility adjustments. So I keep the labor supply constant, but I adjust fertility. I do this, by the way, for the pretreatment sample, obviously. And in the fourth scenario, I introduce both negative labor supply effects and fertility adjustment to sort of see an interaction between these two. And these behavioral effects are based on these estimates from my other paper when it comes to labor supply effects and fertility. I reweight the pretreatment birth structure to match the post-introduction birth structure based on income deciles, based on differences in the birth rates for income deciles. And these adjustments that I take into account are like averages over a long period, like over the 3 or 4 post-treatment years. Right. So just to show you what I'm actually, inputting what are my inputs in the microsimulation. Here you can see the differences in birth shares in the share of births, so share of all births for income deciles, right? So if there would be no variation, then they all should be like 10%. But what you can see is essentially that for those deciles that are income deciles that are below median, you can see an increase in their share of all births, whereas for all the deciles that are above the median, you can see that their share of all births declined in the post-introduction period, right? So you have now more than 50% of births in this low, let's say low income or below median income group, as it was. This is just something that was shown also before in this time series graphs, but here you can also see it for deciles, not just for below above median. Right, and these are the results. So first of all, the actual poverty rate was around 15%. This is the relative poverty, by the way. And then the direct sort of mechanical effect, if there would be no behavioral adjustments, we would achieve poverty decline of like 10 percentage points. So essentially, it would decline by 2/3. We know that it's not the case in the descriptive in the descriptives. So what are the contributions of labor supply and fertility adjustments? You can see that there's a pretty non-negligible, even though these labor supply responses are pretty small, that I assume. You can see non-negligible reductions in the scale of the poverty reduction due to labor supply adjustments, but there's essentially nothing happening when it, due to these fertility adjustments. Their contribution is extremely small, and then there is this interaction, which is also pretty small. So the counterfactual poverty in the end is like half of the poverty rate that we would have that we would have without the program, essentially. So essentially, all these so this labor supply, fertility, and interaction of these two channels, they reduce the scale of poverty reduction by around half, not more than a half, essentially. And it might be a bit surprising, given these large adjustments like infertility in the sort of the income in the sort of income structure of fertility. But this role of adverse fertility adjustments in limiting poverty reduction is very small in the end. Why? Because there are these large direct effects of the cash transfers. So this negative and the negative role of fertility adjustment may be amplified by negative labor supply response. So you saw the interaction, but essentially it would be technically possible to end the absolute child poverty. I mean, okay, so this one was I told you that it's relative, but I actually take just the threshold is relative, right? So in the end, it's I'm not really adjusting it for like changes in income, because maybe that was not clear. But I take the threshold, which is essentially absolute. So it is possible to end absolute child poverty by a single law if the transfer amount is close to the poverty line, right? Because, for instance, in Poland, the amount of the transfer was equal to 90% of the poverty line expressed in equivalized income. So, even those families that would reduce their labor supply to zero, essentially, even with no incomes other than child-bearing families with 3 children or more, they would have equalized income above the poverty line, right? So child poverty in the end is a political choice, and we should not really care so much about this fertility adjustment, at least when we think about their impact on child poverty reduction, right? So this is how it looks like. This is because this was all like my sort of microsimulation and everything. It's a lot of assumptions and so on. But here it is how it looks like essentially in the data when you look at the child poverty rates across countries. Across OECD countries, and you can see this negative relationship between the government spending on family benefits. Unfortunately, we don't have data on government spending on child benefits in particular, so it's also like parental leaves, as I said before. But essentially, you can see this huge this negative relationship between spending and child poverty. So it's really like countries that spend more on family benefits, they have lower child poverty rates. And what's important is, between the 2015 and 2019, Poland moved quite a bit, right? So quite moved in terms of like increased the government spending on family benefits, and also moved in terms of child poverty. So we reduced child poverty. Quite a lot by around a half. And the same picture is even stronger picture, I guess, is when we look at the material deprivation in the the statistics provided by Eurostat. You can clearly see again Poland increased the government spending on family benefits, and the reductions in the material deprivations were huge. So we became one of the countries with lowest material deprivation, essentially, among families with children, because material deprivation is essentially a measure of a kind of an absolute poverty. Yes. Right. So the conclusion. So first of all, it's important to study this universal child benefit in Poland because it was exceptionally large and unexpected shock. We see large adjustment in the structure of births. So we see that a larger share of children are now born in low-income couples. These large adjustments have little impact on overall poverty reduction, which may be a bit surprising. But it's because children will not be born into poverty if the child benefit amount is sufficient to protect them from poverty. And importantly, this paper ignores long-term effects on children's outcomes in adulthood, and we know from other papers that these tend to be large and positive. So we see that children that were born into families that received social assistance, they had better health and then better education, and in the end, also higher productivity, higher earnings. So this is something I obviously do not account for it here. Although I have to say these papers do not also account for these changes in the selection, right? So, so they essentially don't really usually account for the fact that now they are looking at technically a little bit more disadvantaged children than before, if these adjustments are similar, to the Polish case. So.